Good morning. We're going to continue talking about genetics today. And what I'd like to start with is by reminding you what kind of the big picture ideas are. Um, and the first big picture idea has to do with the material that we're studying. We're looking at um, the chemicals in our cells and how those chemicals determine how we look and, to a certain extent, how we behave. This is true not just for humans, but for all organisms. The chemical in particular that we're talking about is DNA. It tells your cells how to make proteins. And while that's pretty much it, that is also pretty much everything because inside your cell, the machinery that does all the stuff that keeps your cells working, keeps your body alive, is for the most part done by proteins. Proteins are used as structural pieces. Proteins are used as enzymes to facilitate um, building and taking apart other molecules. It's your proteins that make you unique, and it's your DNA that determines what your proteins look like. So the big question that we've been thinking about is this idea that um, when when we look at kids, young adults, little kids, we see resemblances to their parents, but we don't see exact similarity. And that's kind of interesting to think about. One of the things that's neat about that is that we're actually mostly surprised when people look really similar to their relatives. We're not so surprised if we meet somebody and they sort of look like their mom or their cousin or their aunt or uncle or something. But when we meet somebody and they look really strongly like a family member, our response is usually to say, "Wow, you look so much like so and so. You look so much like your brother." Um, but if you think about it, I mean, we're just used to that. It's why it's we're used to the idea that we look similar to, but not exactly like our parents and other relatives. When you think about the fact that we get shocked at that real strong similarity, it actually is kind of interesting because you would think that we would look more like our parents. I mean, I would sort of expect if I didn't know anything about DNA and genetics that we might look like a mix of our parents, that we might sort of look like a blend, in which case we probably would really strongly resemble our parents. But oftentimes there's some big differences, ways in which we don't look like our parents at all. Um, and another thing that's kind of interesting about this is that it's really the opposite situation for organisms that reproduce asexually, for organisms that simply clone themselves. When we see a clone of either, like when we look at clones of sheep or other animals, or if we look at clones of plants, or when we look at organisms like bacteria that reproduce simply by dividing, um, they look identical, they behave identically, and they have the identical chemicals inside their cells. The DNA is the same. And we're not really surprised about that. So we kind of have this dual like expectation. We know that some organisms like people and dolphins and chickens are going to somewhat resemble their parents, but not exactly. Whereas we expect that other organisms, clones, are going to resemble their parents exactly, both physically, behaviorally, and also chemically. And that doesn't surprise us either. So, what is the explanation behind this? How is it that we can start with one parent with one set of genes, another parent with another set of genes, and end up with an offspring with a completely different set of genes? How does that happen? And part of the key is thinking about meiosis and how um, homologous chromosomes split apart during meiosis. And part of it is thinking about fertilization, which during which two cells, with each of which has a single set of chromosomes, will fuse together. Um, and part of it is understanding how allele pairs work in combination to determine the appearance and the behavior of an organism, like a person or other. diploid sexually reproducing organisms. So that's kind of the content. That's what we're going to be learning about. And then what I want you to think about is how we're going to assess this. And part of what we're going to be looking for is evidence that you know more than just the words, that you can do more than just fill in some blanks on a test um, or a lab report, but we want to see evidence of full understanding. So the kinds of questions you're going to be asked are questions that really require you essentially to teach this material. You're going to need to be able to explain and you're going to need to be able to answer follow-up questions. And that's going to be something that requires you to do more than just memorize the information. You're going to have a really deep understanding of how these things work, how everything goes together, and you're going to need to be able to respond to questions that are designed to really get at that understanding.